Jane Bella stepped off the elevator, her heart pounding in anticipation of the upcoming business meeting. The grandeur of the hotel's marble floors and sparkling chandeliers felt foreign to her, but she was determined not to let the intimidating luxury get to her. She approached the front desk, where a distracted receptionist handed her a key card with a polite but absent smile. "Room 905, ma'am. Enjoy your stay." Jane barely had time to digest the slip-up. As the elevator doors closed behind her, she noticed the key was marked for an extravagant suite. She brushed it off, wondering if it was a lucky upgrade. When she reached the room, the door clicked open easily. The space inside was nothing like she expected. Glistening, spacious, with plush carpets and lavish decor that made her feel instantly out of place. Still, exhaustion tugged at her. She dropped her suitcase and sighed in relief, eager to unwind. But when she opened the bathroom door, her entire world seemed to stop. There, standing in front of her, was a tall, striking man, his damp hair pushed back from a chiseled face. A towel clung low around his hips, and his dark eyes locked with hers. "Who the hell are you?" he asked, his deep voice sending a rush of panic through her veins. And just like that, Jane's business trip took an unexpected turn. Jane froze at the sight of the man, her heart skittering in her chest. He was nothing like the image of the hotel owner she had imagined. Taller than anyone she'd ever met, his body was like something carved from marble. The towel wrapped loosely around his waist hung dangerously low, water droplets glistening on his bare chest. Her mouth went dry, and for a moment she couldn't move or speak. His dark eyes pierced her, and for a second they just stared at each other, both frozen in shock. Jane's mind raced, scrambling for an explanation, but nothing came. She was in the wrong room. She didn't belong here. "Who the hell are you?" His voice was deep, commanding, cutting through the awkward silence like a knife. Jane's body was still rooted to the spot, her brain struggling to catch up with her surroundings. What was she supposed to say? She started, her voice betraying her. "I'm so sorry. I think I've got the wrong room." The words came out breathless and panicked, her hand instinctively clutching the handle of her suitcase. The tension was suffocating. The man didn't move, his piercing gaze still trained on her as if trying to read her every thought. Jane's face flushed with embarrassment. She had never felt so out of place, so exposed. "I'm sorry. I didn't know anyone was in here," she mumbled, looking everywhere but at him. She took a small step back, hoping that somehow the world would right itself, but then her foot slipped on the smooth tile of the bathroom floor. She reached out instinctively for balance, but it was too late. Her body lurched forward, and before she could stop it, she collided with him. He caught her effortlessly, his warm, damp skin pressing against hers. The sheer force of the contact sent a shock through her body, and Jane's breath hitched. Her face burned with embarrassment as she realized just how close she was to him, feeling his firm chest beneath her hands, the heat of his body enveloping her. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low, almost teasing, but with an undercurrent of something else. Jane pulled back, startled by the softness in his tone. "Yes, I'm fine," she stammered, trying to regain her composure. She backed away quickly, the awkwardness thick in the air between them, but as she spun toward the door, ready to bolt, she realized it wasn't going to be that simple. The door wouldn't open. Jane turned the handle, frustrated, tugging on it with all her strength, but the door didn't budge. Her pulse quickened, panic rising in her throat. "It's locked," the man said, his voice devoid of emotion, but his gaze never left her. "The door's locked." Her breath caught. Locked? She tried again, desperate to get out, but nothing happened. "What do you mean, locked?" Jane's voice cracked, her panic creeping in. This was impossible. She couldn't be trapped in here with him. She was supposed to be on a business trip, not stuck in a suite with a stranger, a billionaire no less. He walked over casually, his feet making no sound against the plush carpet, and tried the handle himself. It didn't move. "We're stuck here," he said with a calmness that only made Jane's heart race faster. She stepped back, her fingers tightening around her suitcase, her mind running through every possible scenario. "How long do you think it will take to fix this?" she asked, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "I don't know," he said, almost absently. His eyes swept over her, making her feel like she was being examined under a microscope. Jane shifted uncomfortably, wondering if he could read the discomfort written all over her face. "What are we supposed to do now?" she whispered, mostly to herself. The locked door loomed like a silent reminder of her situation. She was stuck here with a man she didn't know, in a room she didn't belong in. The tension between them hung in the air, thick and undeniable. And Jane had a feeling that her business trip was about to take another unexpected turn. Jane stood in front of the door, her fingers still gripping the handle as if sheer willpower might somehow force it to open. But it didn't. The reality of the situation was settling in like a weight on her chest. She was stuck. Stuck in a luxurious suite with a man she barely knew, a man who was far more intimidating than she had initially realized. Her thoughts raced. What was she supposed to do now? She didn't know this man, and yet here they were, locked in his private suite with no way out. The panic from earlier slowly transformed into something else, a kind of cold, creeping unease. She turned to him, her mind still in a haze. Anthony hadn't moved. He stood there, watching her, his expression unreadable. There was something about his stillness, his silence, that made the space between them feel even more charged. He seemed so composed, so in control, and yet they were both in the same position now, trapped. "I thought you said you had it all figured out," Jane said, trying to mask the tremor in her voice. She wasn't sure what she was trying to prove, maybe that she wasn't as intimidated by him as she clearly was. His eyes flickered over to her, cool but not unkind. "I didn't expect this either," he replied. "But we're stuck here, and panicking isn't going to help." Jane sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Great. Just great." She could feel the frustration bubbling inside her, mixing with the awkward tension in the room. She had always prided herself on being in control of situations, but this was different. She had no control here, and the realization stung. The silence stretched on, neither of them making a move. She had no idea how long it had been since they realized the door was locked, but every passing second felt like a small eternity. The room was too quiet now, the weight of the situation pressing down on her chest with each breath. Finally, Anthony spoke again, his voice calm, almost too calm for the circumstances. "Let's just wait for someone to come fix this," he said. "In the meantime, we might as well try to make the best of it." Jane blinked at him, uncertain whether he was being sincere or just trying to break the tension. Either way, his suggestion seemed more reasonable than anything she could come up with. Slowly, she nodded. "Fine," she muttered, more to herself than to him, but as she stood there, with the realization that they couldn't leave, Jane felt the heaviness of the moment, the isolation of being trapped in a room with a stranger, with no way out. This wasn't how her business trip was supposed to go. The silence between them stretched as the minutes passed, thick with discomfort and the weight of their trapped situation. Jane glanced at Anthony, who was standing across from her with his arms crossed, still strangely calm in the face of their dilemma. She, on the other hand, felt anything but calm. The awkward tension hung in the air, thick as smoke, and she wasn't sure how to handle it. "Do you have any idea how long this might take?" Jane asked, her voice laced with frustration. She hated feeling so powerless, so out of control. Anthony looked at her, his gaze steady. "I'm not sure," he said, "but there's no point in stressing over something we can't change right now. We'll figure it out." "Easy for you to say," Jane muttered under her breath, though she wasn't sure why she was so irritated. Maybe it was because of the embarrassment of the situation, or maybe it was because she wasn't used to being stuck in such an awkward, helpless position. Her eyes wandered around the suite, as if focusing on anything else would distract her from the discomfort she was feeling. The lavish furnishings, the plush carpet, the sprawling views from the windows, everything about this place felt too perfect for someone like her. The stark contrast between her life and this luxurious space only added to the unease gnawing at her. "Here," Anthony suddenly said, pulling her out of her thoughts. "Let's try something to take the edge off." He moved to the minibar and grabbed a bottle of whiskey. Jane watched him, unsure what to make of it. He poured a glass and handed it to her without a word. She hesitated, eyeing the amber liquid, then reluctantly took the glass from him. "I don't drink," she said softly, her hand gripping the glass tightly as if it might break from the tension. She wasn't a drinker, never had been. It felt wrong, but she was too tired, too rattled by everything that had happened, to argue. "Just a sip," he said, his voice gentle but insistent. "It'll help you relax." She sighed, knowing he was right. It wasn't like she had much choice. She took a small sip, and immediately the burn of the whiskey hit her throat, making her cough a little. Anthony chuckled, a low, warm sound that felt oddly comforting in the midst of all this chaos. "See, it's not so bad," he said with a smile. "Let it settle for a second." Jane took another sip, feeling the warmth spread through her chest. She was surprised by how much the tension in her body eased with that one small action. The burn was still there, but it wasn't as unbearable as the knot of anxiety she'd been carrying. The silence between them softened, and for the first time since they'd locked eyes, she felt the air between them shift, not as strangers, but as people sharing a strange moment together. Jane blinked, surprised at how much the whiskey had started to dull the edges of her discomfort. It was a strange, foreign feeling, like stepping into a different world, where everything was a little less sharp, a little less overwhelming. She could feel the tension in her shoulders loosening, her heartbeat slowing just a little. "Not so bad, huh?" Anthony's voice broke the stillness, and Jane glanced at him. He was leaning casually against the minibar, watching her, his glass of whiskey in hand. His gaze was no longer as intense as it had been when they first met, though there was still something about him, something commanding and unspoken, that made her feel small in his presence. Jane nodded slowly, bringing the glass back to her lips, taking another careful sip. "I guess it helps," she admitted, her voice quieter than she intended. She didn't really drink, but in this moment, it felt like a small relief, something to take her mind off the strangeness of being stuck here with him. "I don't usually drink either," Anthony said, breaking the silence again, "but sometimes it's the only thing that makes the world seem a little more manageable." His words surprised her. Here she was, assuming he had everything figured out, being a billionaire, in control of his empire, exuding power at every turn. But now, with the light tension between them fading, Jane could see something else. Beneath the surface of the wealthy businessman, there was a man who, too, had moments when things felt just as unmanageable as they did for her. "I didn't expect to end up here," Jane confessed, glancing down at her glass. "A mix-up, a locked door, and now, this." Anthony smiled, just a small curve of his lips. "Yeah, not what either of us planned, I'm sure." The shared absurdity of the situation hung in the air between them, and for a moment the tension didn't feel so heavy. It wasn't just a mix-up. It was something more, a strange, unexpected situation where neither of them had any control over how things were unfolding. Jane took another sip, the warmth spreading through her, her mind now a little clearer. "What happens now?" she asked, finally meeting his gaze again. The question hung in the air, loaded with unspoken meaning. What happened now that they were trapped in this suite together, uncertain of when they would be able to leave? Was this an accident or something more? Anthony shrugged, his tone casual, but there was an undercurrent of sincerity. "We wait, I guess. But while we're here, we might as well try to enjoy the time. What's the worst that could happen?" The words were simple, but in that moment, they felt like a shared agreement, a kind of truce between two strangers caught in an unexpected circumstance. Jane nodded, and for the first time since walking into this suite, she felt the weight of the situation begin to lift, just a little. The following morning, Jane woke with a jolt, her body stiff from an uncomfortable night on the luxurious bed. The faint rays of sunlight streamed through the half-drawn curtains, casting a soft golden glow over the room. She rubbed her eyes, disoriented for a moment, until the events of the night before flooded back to her. The awkward encounter, the locked door, the whiskey, and Anthony, standing there with his calm, commanding presence, making everything feel different. She sat up quickly, her heart racing. What had happened? Her mind struggled to piece together the fragments of the previous night. She had drunk, she had laughed, and she had talked to a man she barely knew about things she hadn't meant to share. The walls she had carefully built around herself had begun to crumble, just a little, and it scared her. Jane glanced around the room, noting the stillness. The suite was quiet, the kind of silence that settled like dust, but it didn't feel oppressive, just empty, like the quiet after a storm. She pulled herself out of bed, her bare feet sinking into the thick carpet as she moved to the bathroom. The cool tiles against her feet gave her a brief sense of clarity. She stepped into the shower, hoping the steam would clear the fog in her mind, but as she glanced at her reflection in the mirror, she froze. There, in the corner of the mirror, a small detail caught her eye. The faintest smear of blood stained the pristine white sheets from the night before. Her heart sank in her chest. She stumbled back, hand reaching for the edge of the counter to steady herself. The truth hit her like a wave, hard, cold, undeniable. Her body had betrayed her, and she was now standing at the edge of something she wasn't prepared for. She was pregnant. The realization twisted in her gut, sending a ripple of panic through her veins. Her chest tightened, and she gripped the edge of the counter, trying to breathe through the suffocating sense of fear. This wasn't what she had planned for, not here, not like this. She turned to face herself in the mirror again, but the woman staring back at her felt unfamiliar, as though everything about her life had just shifted in an instant. The life she had known, the one she had carefully built, was about to change in ways she couldn't yet understand. Anthony's face flickered in her mind, and she pushed the thought away. She wasn't ready to think about him, or what would happen next. Not yet. With a trembling hand, she reached for her phone, dialing the number for her doctor. But as the phone rang, she knew this wasn't something she could fix or ignore. The reality was unavoidable. She wasn't the same person anymore. This wasn't just about a mistake. It was about a new reality she had no control over. And in that moment, she knew everything had just changed. The knock on the door startled Jane, pulling her from her spiraling thoughts. She hadn't been able to get a grip on herself since the discovery, her mind caught between fear and the overwhelming weight of what was happening. She could feel her heart pounding as she stood frozen in place, unsure whether she wanted to face anyone or just disappear entirely. The knock came again, more insistent this time. "Jane?" It was Anthony's voice. Calm, controlled, but there was a hint of concern that made her pause. He wasn't the kind of man to show vulnerability, but there it was, lurking beneath the surface. She quickly wiped her face, the shock of everything still heavy in her chest. Her stomach churned. The last thing she needed was to confront him now. Not after last night, after everything that had happened, but she couldn't ignore him forever. Slowly, she made her way to the door, her heart still racing. She opened it just a crack, enough to see him standing there. His posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp, as if he was waiting for her to fall apart in front of him. "I know this is a lot to process," Anthony said, his voice steady. He was dressed in a simple shirt and trousers, his usual polished self, but something in his eyes was different. Genuine concern, maybe even a little vulnerability. "I'm sorry. For everything." Jane took a deep breath, her throat tight. She didn't know how to respond. The apology didn't feel like enough. Not after what had happened, not after she'd found out she was carrying his child, but instead of pushing him away, She found herself opening the door just a little more, allowing him inside. I didn't expect this. She swallowed hard, her emotions a tangled mess she didn't know how to untangle. I don't even know what to do, Anthony. He stepped inside, his eyes never leaving hers. He looked at her, as if searching for the right words. We're both in this, Jane. I'm not going to leave you alone to deal with it. Whatever it takes, I'm here. She felt a flicker of something, uncertainty, fear, but also a strange warmth that she couldn't ignore. Could she trust him? Could she trust herself to make the right decision? Jane glanced down at her hands, which were clenched tightly around the towel wrapped around her body. I can't do this alone. You won't have to, he said softly, his voice like a steady anchor in the storm she was feeling inside. His words were simple, but they hit her harder than she expected. For a moment, the world outside the suite disappeared. All that mattered was what was right in front of her, this man, his promise, and the weight of the future they were now bound to share, no matter how unexpected or terrifying it felt. I'm not asking you to fix this, Jane said quietly, her voice shaking, but her resolve beginning to form. I don't know how to fix me. You don't have to, he replied, stepping closer. You don't have to fix anything, not alone. Jane sat on the edge of the bed, the stillness of the room surrounding her, thick with uncertainty. Anthony's words echoed in her mind, each one a promise wrapped in a sincerity she wasn't sure she was ready to trust. He'd told her he would be there, but how could she be certain? How could she trust him, trust anything, after everything that had happened? Her fingers tightened around the edges of the towel she'd wrapped herself in, a feeble attempt to shield herself from the emotions that were threatening to spill over. She hadn't been prepared for this, for the strange intimacy of the situation or the reality of what was to come. She glanced up at him, and for a brief moment their eyes locked. He wasn't looking at her like she was some mistake to be fixed, not like she'd imagined he might. His gaze wasn't cold or calculating, but warm, earnest, even a little unsure. For the first time since they'd met, he didn't look like the powerful businessman who controlled everything around him. He looked like a man, vulnerable and real, standing in front of her, uncertain of what came next. I didn't mean for this to happen, Jane whispered, more to herself than to him. Her voice cracked, and she felt the sting of tears threatening to escape. She was supposed to have control, but now everything felt like it was slipping away. Anthony took a small step forward, his expression softening. I know you didn't, but it's happened, and we'll figure it out. His words were simple, but they struck a chord deep inside her. Maybe she didn't have all the answers. Maybe she didn't even know what the future held. But standing here with him, in this suite, with the weight of everything bearing down on her, she realized something. She wasn't alone. For the first time since discovering her pregnancy, Jane felt the slightest flicker of something, hope, perhaps, or the beginnings of trust. It wasn't much, but it was enough to allow her to meet his gaze without fear. I'm scared, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what to do. I don't even know if I'm doing the right thing by staying here with you. Anthony knelt in front of her, his presence solid and unwavering. He placed a hand gently on hers, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. You don't have to do anything alone, he said quietly. I'm not asking you to have all the answers right now. Just don't shut me out. Jane inhaled sharply, the truth of his words settling over her like a warm blanket. She wasn't ready for everything, but maybe, just maybe, she could let him help her figure it out. For the first time, she didn't feel so trapped. Not by the locked door, not by the situation, and not by the future she had yet to understand. The weight of her fear still lingered, but now there was something else too, a faint but undeniable thread of trust. The day passed in a haze. Jane couldn't remember exactly when Anthony had left the room or when she had fallen asleep again, but by the time she woke, the sun was low in the sky, casting a golden glow through the windows. She hadn't felt like she'd slept at all, but her mind was exhausted from the weight of everything. Her emotions were tangled, every thought pulling her in a different direction. She glanced over at the door, expecting to see Anthony, but the room was quiet. The thought of him still lingered, though. His words, his presence, the way he'd looked at her with so much sincerity, yet still the uncertainty gnawed at her. She was caught between the desire to trust him and the fear that doing so would only lead to more hurt. She pulled herself out of bed, moving slowly, like she wasn't entirely sure how to navigate this strange new world she was in. Her hand reached for the bathroom door, and as she stepped inside, the familiar sense of control that she usually had over herself slipped further away. She ran water over her face, trying to shake off the fog in her mind. Her reflection in the mirror startled her. She looked different. The exhaustion weighed on her, and her eyes were puffy, but it wasn't just the physical toll, it was something deeper, something she couldn't hide. The realization of what had happened was like a weight, heavy in her chest. She had no idea how to move forward. Her thoughts were a storm, each one colliding with the next. The pregnancy. Anthony. What was she supposed to do now? She leaned against the sink, letting the cool porcelain ground her, trying to focus on something, anything that made sense. Her fingers gripped the edge of the counter as her breath steadied. "You can't run from this, Jane," she whispered to herself. It was the truth. The weight of her choices was there, no matter how hard she tried to escape it. The knock on the door startled her again, and her heart skipped. She hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to respond. The thought of facing Anthony again, after everything, felt like too much. Another knock. She wiped her hands on her towel and walked to the door, taking a deep breath before opening it. There he stood, looking at her with those intense eyes, his expression unreadable. He was dressed casually, his usual business-like demeanor softened. "I brought breakfast," Anthony said, holding out a tray with fresh fruit and coffee. For a moment, Jane stood there, unsure what to say, until she finally found her voice. "Thank you," she replied, her voice quieter than she'd meant. He smiled slightly, but it was soft, as if he understood the storm she was weathering inside. He stepped inside, setting the tray on the bed before turning back to face her. "I know this is a lot to take in," he said, "but we can talk about it whenever you're ready." The vulnerability in his voice made Jane's chest tighten, but there was something else too. The kindness he was offering, despite the mess of it all, tugged at something deep inside her. Maybe she wasn't ready to face the future, but for the first time in a long while, she wasn't facing it alone. "Maybe I'm not ready yet," Jane whispered, more to herself than to him, but when she finally met his gaze, there was a flicker of something new. Hope, maybe. "Take your time," Anthony said, his voice warm. "I'll be here." The days that followed were a blur for Jane. She woke every morning to the same heavy weight in her chest, the reality of what was happening slowly sinking in. Each time she looked at Anthony, something in her stirred, complicated, conflicting feelings that she couldn't quite place. The future was uncertain, and she was caught between fear and something else she wasn't ready to confront. Anthony continued to give her space, but every time they crossed paths, his presence was a reminder of everything that had changed in the span of a few days. She couldn't quite understand what he wanted from her, and the fact that he kept showing up, offering her breakfast, checking in, never pushing, left her both grateful and confused. She hadn't asked for this, but he was there, willing to help her carry the weight of something she hadn't signed up for. One evening, after another quiet, tense day spent in the suite, Jane found herself sitting on the balcony, staring out over the city skyline as the sun set behind the towering buildings. The golden hues bathed the room in warmth, but it didn't erase the cold knot in her stomach. She had never been one to face challenges head-on, to confront uncomfortable truths, but now she had no choice. The path she was on wasn't one she could walk alone, and for the first time she realized that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to. The soft click of the door behind her startled her. She didn't have to turn around to know who it was. She had felt his presence long before he spoke. "You've been avoiding me." Anthony's voice came, soft and unassuming, but with an edge that made her heart skip. "I get it. This is a lot to process, but you don't have to do it alone." Jane's hands gripped the edge of the railing as she turned to face him. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, those dark, steady eyes, held something she hadn't expected, something vulnerable. "I don't know what I'm doing, Anthony," she said, her voice quiet, raw. The words had been lodged in her throat for days, but now they came out in a rush, everything spilling out all at once. "I'm scared. I'm scared of what this means. Scared of how everything is changing." He stepped closer, his presence as steady as ever. "I'm not going anywhere, Jane. You don't have to be scared anymore." For a moment, she just stared at him, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never allowed herself to be this vulnerable, to let someone else see just how terrified she was of what the future might hold. "I don't know if I can trust you," she said finally, her words soft but firm. "I don't know if I can trust myself." Anthony's gaze softened, and for the first time there was no arrogance, no sense of power, just a man who seemed as uncertain as she felt. "You don't have to trust me all at once," he said, his voice gentle but unwavering. "But you can trust that I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Jane swallowed hard, feeling the tension in her chest begin to ease just a little. She wasn't ready to face the world again, to face her reality, but the idea that she didn't have to do it alone, that was something she could hold on to. For the first time, Jane felt a spark of hope flicker inside her, no matter how small. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end. Maybe it was only the beginning. The following days felt like a strange limbo for Jane. She spent most of her time in the suite, her mind consumed by the reality of her situation, but she also found herself inexplicably drawn to Anthony's steady presence. Despite the uncertainty, he never pressured her to make any decisions or move faster than she was ready for. Instead, he allowed her the space to process everything, offering her quiet support without expecting anything in return. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a soft orange light over the city, Jane found herself once again on the balcony, gazing out over the skyline. Her fingers traced the rim of the glass in her hand, but her mind was miles away. The familiar anxiety was still there, gnawing at her, but there was something else now, too, something she hadn't felt in a long time. A soft knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts, and she sighed, knowing who it was before she even turned around. She didn't have to wonder anymore. "Mind if I join you?" Anthony's voice came from behind her, gentle, but with a hint of something deeper, a quiet, unspoken understanding. She nodded without saying a word, and he stepped onto the balcony, his presence somehow both reassuring and overwhelming. They stood in silence for a moment, the city noises fading into the background, leaving only the sound of their breathing, the faint rustle of the wind against the curtains. Jane took a long sip from her glass, savoring the warmth it brought to her body, even though it did little to soothe the chaos inside her. "I don't know what to do anymore," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. She hadn't meant to speak, but the words slipped out before she could stop them. "Everything feels so out of control." Anthony's gaze softened, and he moved closer, standing beside her, but not too close, just enough to offer silent solidarity. "I know," he said quietly, "and I wish I could make it easier for you, but I won't pretend to have all the answers either. All I can do is be here." The simplicity of his words settled in her chest like a balm. She had spent so long running from the mess of her life, trying to keep everything in neat little boxes, but now, standing here with him, she realized that maybe, for the first time, it was okay to not have everything figured out. "I'm scared," Jane admitted, her voice raw. She glanced at him, as if seeing him for the first time in this light, not as a businessman or someone with power, but as a man who was quietly present in her life when she needed him most. "I'm scared that I'm not strong enough for this." He turned to face her fully, his expression open and unguarded. "You're stronger than you think, Jane. I've seen it. And you don't have to be strong all the time. Not with me." Her chest tightened as she looked at him, feeling the weight of his words, the honesty behind them. She didn't know what the future held, or even what her next step should be, but standing here, with him by her side, she didn't feel as alone as she had before. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It felt like the quiet before something important, something life-changing, was about to happen, and maybe, for the first time, Jane was ready to face it. The next few days passed in a quiet, almost surreal haze. Jane moved through them like she was half present, her mind constantly preoccupied with the weight of the situation. She spent her mornings on the balcony, her gaze lost in the city below, while Anthony continued to give her space but never stopped being there. He didn't push her to make any decisions, but there was something in the way he looked at her, something in his actions that told her he wasn't leaving. Not yet. One evening, after dinner, she found herself alone again in the suite. She had spent most of the day lost in her thoughts, trying to come to terms with what was happening, but the emotional exhaustion was starting to catch up with her. The weight of everything, the pregnancy, her fear of the future, her doubts about herself, it all felt like too much. She walked to the window, her hands resting on the sill as she stared out at the sprawling city. She wasn't sure what she was waiting for anymore. The future felt so far out of reach, as if it had become a distant dream that she couldn't quite touch. The soft click of the door behind her broke her reverie, and she turned, startled, to see Anthony standing in the doorway. He was still in his business attire, though his tie was loosened, and there was a weariness about him that hadn't been there before. His eyes met hers, steady and calm, as if he could see the storm swirling inside her. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle but insistent. He took a step forward, his presence filling the space between them. Jane's heart fluttered at the concern in his voice. "I don't know," she whispered, turning away from him, her fingers digging into the windowsill. "I don't know if I'm ever going to be okay." Anthony was silent for a moment, and then, to her surprise, he stepped up beside her, his arm brushing against hers. His presence was grounding, offering a quiet comfort she hadn't realized she needed. "You will be," he said softly, his voice steady. "It might not feel like it now, but you will be, and you don't have to do it alone." Jane swallowed hard, fighting the tears that threatened to escape. She didn't want to cry. She didn't want to admit how lost she felt, how unsure of everything she was. But Anthony didn't let her pull away. He stayed by her side, his warmth just a few inches away, reminding her that, maybe for once, she didn't have to carry the weight of everything on her own. "Do you really mean that?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Anthony's hand reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. The simple touch sent a ripple of warmth through her, and for the first time in days, she felt a flicker of hope. "I do," he said, his voice low and sincere. "You don't have to figure this out by yourself. I'm not going anywhere." His words sank deep into her chest, and for the first time since this whole mess started, Jane felt the tiniest glimmer of peace. The fear was still there, lurking in the background, but for now, just for this moment, she wasn't as alone as she had been before. Maybe, just maybe, she could find her way through this. With Anthony by her side, it didn't seem quite as impossible. The quiet comfort of his presence wrapped around her like a blanket, and Jane felt the weight in her chest lighten, just a little. The storm in her mind hadn't calmed entirely, but in that moment, with Anthony standing beside her, offering nothing more than a steady presence, she realized something. Maybe it didn't have to be figured out all at once. Maybe she didn't have to carry everything alone. She glanced at him, his eyes focused on hers, unwavering in their sincerity. There was no rush in his gaze, no demand, just an understanding that he was there, for whatever it was worth. For the first time in days, Jane felt herself let go of the tight grip on her emotions. Her shoulders relaxed, and she took a deep breath, the air feeling a little easier to inhale. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Anthony didn't say anything in return, but his expression softened, his hand reaching out to rest on her shoulder. The touch was reassuring, grounding. They didn't need words for this moment. Outside, the city lights shimmered like stars fallen to earth, and the soft hum of the evening settled over them. For once, Jane allowed herself to believe that maybe this wasn't the end of everything. Maybe it was just the beginning of learning to trust again, of stepping into the unknown, and of finding a path forward, one she didn't have to walk alone. As the night stretched on, she didn't have all the answers, and she wasn't sure what would come next. But for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt something she hadn't dared to feel in so long. Hope. With a steadying breath, she turned back to the window, looking out at the city below, and for the first time, the future didn't seem so distant. She wasn't sure what lay ahead, but she wasn't afraid to face it, not anymore.